Okay, can somebody confirm you can hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Thank you. Before we begin, are there any questions? All right, not hearing anything. You should be able to see my screen now. Today is October 21st, and we should be on chapter 14 and finishing it. I'm not sure we'll finish it, but we'll be close. Any questions about any of that? Let me mention there will be no lab today. I will log in for the first 15 minutes to answer any questions, but after 15 minutes or the last question, I will log out. Any question about any of that? All right. I guess I'll leave this here. Let's go to chapter 14. I have that we were on this slide and I mentioned that bacteremia is the presence of bacteria in the blood, septicemia, where there is actually a growth of the bacteria in the blood, toxemia, the presence of toxin in the blood, and viremia, the presence of viruses in the blood. Talking a little further about the extent of host involvement in an infection, the state of host resistance also determines the state or the extent of the infection. A primary infection, did we talk about this? Primary infection?
We did, yeah.
What slide are we on if we did talk about this? No, we didn't talk about latent infection. Maybe I started talking about that um, slide, but I think maybe we had started this and I stopped it. All right, a primary infection is an acute infection that causes the initial illness. A secondary infection is an opportunistic infection after a primary infection is predisposed the person and weakened their immune defense. Um, so an opportunistic infection is one that needs something else to get it started. And the primary infection just weakens the host, like maybe damaging the mucosal membrane or weakening their immune system. And then the secondary infection can get a hold. A subclinical infection or subclinical disease is where the patient has no noticeable signs or symptoms. So it's an inapparent infection. We've talked about this before. I didn't call it a subclinical disease. I called it the heck is it? Uh, Drawing a blank here on what we called it before, where the patient has no signs or symptoms of an infection, but they have the disease carrying organism and they can shed that disease carrying organism, and then other people can get the disease. If I didn't mention, and hopefully I did, COVID-19, about 50% of young people, that would be mostly you and teenagers and children, when they have a COVID-19 infection, it will be subclinical, inapparent disease. Oh, what was the other term we used for this? Drawing a blank there. If you guys know it, go ahead and mention it. I'm drawing a blank on another term for that. We called it I don't remember what we called it. Boy, that's pretty bad. Um, anyway, some people can actually carry a polio virus and never get signs or symptoms of polio, but they can carry the virus with them and then give it to somebody else. And with same with COVID-19. And the point is that uh, a young person can give COVID-19 to like their grandparents, and then COVID-19 will be a very serious infection in their grandparent. Any question about that? All right. A latent disease is a disease where the disease carrying organism goes latent and does not cause disease. So the patient will have no symptoms. The pathogen is inactive, not causing disease. It may be just sitting out. A classic case of a latent disease is shingles, where usually a child comes down with the chickenpox virus. The virus causes disease called the chickenpox, and then the virus goes latent and just sits out in the ganglia of a nerve, and it may sit there for decades, meaning many, many years. And then the patient's immune system weakens and the virus reactivates, comes out of latency, and then causes disease that we call shingles. And shingles is a different disease, and you get sores only in one area, which is innervated by the nerves from coming from that ganglia. Any question about any of that? Another latent disease you may have had is a cold sore, where herpes simplex type 1 gives you a cold sore. And while you have the cold sore, the virus is active and reproducing, causing disease. And then the virus can go latent and just sit out. I'm not sure what cell it's sitting in, but not causing any disease. The cold sore, of course, goes away. And it's just waiting to become reactivated. And then it'll cause another cold sore. Any question about any of that? Latent disease is most often used with viruses, but sometimes it's used with other diseases like tuberculosis, where the bacteria in tuberculosis, it becomes encased in a nodule and cannot spread in the patient or come out of the patient and infect somebody else because it's encased in a nodule, but the bacteria can break the nodule and then cause an active infection in the patient, and then the patient can then spread the bacteria. So latent can be used with other diseases, but like I said, it's primarily used with viral diseases, especially the herpes viruses, herpes family of viruses. Herd immunity is when many people in the population are immune, and then they can protect other people who are not immune. Let me blow this slide up. So initially, if you have the population with no immunity, and then somebody becomes infected, most of the population will come down with the disease. And this was a concern with COVID-19 when it first came out, because nobody had any immunity to it. If, on the other hand, the majority of the population are immune, the yellow individuals, and then somebody is contagious with the disease, the reddish people, the disease can't easily spread and can only spread to those people in close contact with those who are contagious. This person over here, which is not immune, the disease would have to come to this patient or that patient, or maybe both of them, before spreading to them. And these two individuals are immune. So this patient will never be exposed to the disease carrying organism. And then they call that herd immunity, where these people are protected by the immune people. This is the whole point of getting immunized, at least in the United States and countrywide, meaning whatever nation you're in, but for us, the United States, is you get the population immunized at a high enough level and then the non-immunized individuals are protected. The trouble with COVID-19 is, first of all, the virus changes, so you need to get a new vaccine about every year, maybe even more often. And you also have to have the number of people immune in the population 85% or higher. It used to be 85%. It's probably climbed now because the virus is better at spreading than when COVID-19 first came out. But it's probably a little less than 90 or less than 95% for sure. Um, Measles is another very highly contagious disease, and you need at least 90% of the children to be immune to protect those who are not immune. And the trouble is that parents say, oh, measles isn't much of a problem anymore. I'm not going to vaccinate my child. And every once in a while, the immunity drops low enough, either slightly below 90% or around 90%. And then measles can actively spread in the schools. And I remember there was a case of one person bringing a child coming in with measles to Disneyland, and a whole bunch of children got exposed to it and then got it because the immunity levels drop in the population. Any question about any of that? The point is, with herd immunity, you need to have enough of the population immunized, and it depends on the disease. Measles is very high. You need the population very highly immunized. COVID-19 is pretty high. The flu is high, but not anywhere near as high. I don't know what the numbers are for the flu, but it's not 90% of the population. If we look at a disease, we'll notice that it goes through certain patterns of disease development. Normally, there's a specific sequence of events associated with an infection by a microbe, and then the subsequent disease that it causes. First, the disease-carrying organism has to come from a reservoir. This is where the disease exists before it gets in a patient and then causes an active disease infection, which causes the disease. The pathogen must be transmitted to a susceptible host. You need a susceptible host before the organism can infect the patient and then grow in it, and then the pathogen has to invade the host and it has to multiply. Furthermore, the pathogen has to injure the host. If there's no injury to the host, you don't have any active disease. And that's what happens with COVID-19. When a young person gets infected, the COVID-19 is not causing much, if any, damage to young people. And so they have an inapparent infection. You need to injure the host before the patient will have signs and symptoms of disease. The illness will then end in one of two ways. The host immune system can destroy the pathogen, and then the disease goes away, or the pathogen can kill the host, and obviously the disease goes away. Any question about any of that? All right. There are certain factors that can make the body more susceptible to, and therefore affect the occurrence of disease. So I'm going to be talking about predisposing factors. For example, females have a shorter urethra than males, and therefore they have a higher incidence of urinary tract infection. There are some inherited traits, such as sickle cell anemia, which can predispose the individual to getting getting more likely to get a disease. Another trait, which is not necessarily inherited, is diabetes. these patients are more likely to come down with the disease. The climate and weather can be predisposing factors. Everybody knows you're more likely to catch the cold and the flu in the wintertime. And with the flu, it's more than just the fact that we are staying closer together in the building or in the house and that we have the window shut. That helps, but there's other factors too. The winter time, first of all, weakens your host immune defense. And then plus, the winter has less UV light. And then the colder weather also allows the flu virus to live longer, like on your coat or on your shoes, than it would live in the summer months, where the warmer weather actually makes the virus die sooner. And obviously, the summer has stronger UV light, and the UV light also kills viruses. Any question about any of that? So, the climate and weather can be predisposing factors. Fatigue weakens your immune system and then makes you more susceptible to becoming infected. And students should be aware of this because oftentimes they're either studying really late or partying and they're not sleeping enough. And then they become fatigued, making them more likely to become infected. The age is well known to infect the incidence of disease. Let me see if I can show that here. If I can get paint to show. Nothing's showing for some reason. There we go. For most diseases like the cold and the flu, the incidence on the y-axis, and I'm not sure the time, I guess on the x-axis. So this is incidence over here. Yep. For most diseases, come on, mouse. No, this is age right here. That's what that is. Sorry. Um, for most diseases like colds and flus, oh crud, I don't have the right point. There we go. It's the very young and the very old which are more likely to get disease. Now, with COVID-19, it isn't that way. It's only the very, very young, like newborns, which are more likely to get disease. And then very quickly, like 6 months, maybe even younger, the incidence drops very low. And then COVID-19 has a very high, the elderly are primarily infected, much more so than even the newborns. But the very young are at greater risk for getting COVID-19, and COVID-19 will be a more serious disease than the young, like normal children, teenagers, young adults, very low incidence. And then it starts climbing. I don't remember where it becomes significant, if it's age 45 or I know it's age 65, you're at great risk. Let's try and do make it 65. I don't want to type it. Sort of. 65 and older, you're at great risk. And the older you are, the greater the risk and the greater the severity of getting a COVID-19 infection. And that's true for the younger, but like I said, I think this right here is about 6 months is where it drops very low. And certainly it's by 1 year. And normally, young children are a greater risk for getting the disease, like young children, measles, not measles, but malaria, and then colds and flus, greater risk for them. And the thing is, with very young children, it's about equal to the elderly, the risk. And that's not true with COVID-19. COVID-19 is an unusual disease. Lifestyle can predispose people to getting certain disease. It's well known, for example, that smokers are more likely to get a respiratory disease. And it's because smoking damages the mucosal membranes, making the patient more likely to come down with a respiratory disease. Chemotherapy can also predispose an individual to becoming more likely to become infected. Chemotherapy, not only does it weaken the immune system, but it can also like damage the body, like the mucosal membrane or even the skin, and make it more likely that the patient will come down with an infection. Any question about any of these predisposing factors? All right. When we're following the development of disease, it is noted that most diseases follow the same pattern of development. First, the host defenses are breached, and then disease follows a certain sequence. And this is true for both acute and chronic diseases. Let me blow this up so you can see it better. Initially, the patient has no infection, no disease-carrying organisms, and then they become infected, and the organism has to grow in the patient before the patient will have any signs or symptoms. So from the patient being first infected to when they have the first signs or symptoms, that is called the incubation period, where the patient has no signs or symptoms of disease. That's followed by the prodromal period, where the patient has mild signs or symptoms. Like if you're ever walking around and you say to yourself, geez, do I have a sore throat? And you have to think about it. And then you say, yeah, I've got a sore throat. I must be coming down with something. That would be the prodromal period, mild signs or symptoms. That's followed by the period of illness where the signs and symptoms are no longer mild. The signs and symptoms are the most severe in the period of illness. That will be followed by the period of decline where the patient starts getting better. You might notice a patient has a fever and then the fever breaks. That would be the start of the period of decline, where the patient starts getting better. They still have signs and symptoms, but they're decreasing in severity. The signs and symptoms then decrease in severity until they get to a threshold. And you'll note that on this axis, we have the number of microbes increasing on the Y, as well as the increase in the signs and symptoms on the Y. What happens is the disease signs and symptoms decrease until you reach a threshold where you no longer have any signs and symptoms. And that's usually the same time you have a low number of organisms. You still have the organisms with you. So you're in the period of convalescence, no signs or symptoms, but you still have disease-carrying organisms. And then that will be followed, that's the period of convalescence. That will be followed with, what do you call it? Healthy patient. Okay. No longer disease. Any question about any of that? All right, well, here's a question for you. During which period would the patient not be infective? I think everybody knows during the period of illness you're infective. What period are you not infective? Come on, somebody's got
Would
to
it
give a
be
guess.
the decline?
The period decline. No, you still have the disease-carrying organisms and you still have signs and symptoms, so you are still infective. But that's a good guess.
Would it be the incubation period? The no
Uh,
signs or symptoms?
Actually, in the late incubation period, you are infective. In fact, with certain diseases like colds and flu, for at least adults, this is when you are most infective. I'll talk about that in a minute. But late in the incubation period and in the prodromal period, for certain diseases, you're actually more likely to spread disease than in the period of illness. So it's not really in the incubation period either, although you could argue that very, very early in the incubation period, right after you're first infected, you may not spread disease because there's so few disease-carrying organisms in you. But other than that, in the incubation period, you can spread disease. And then the next guess would be the period of convalescence, where you have no signs or symptoms, but you still have disease-carrying organisms. So in reality, you can spread disease in every period of the disease. It's not until you no longer have any disease-carrying organisms that you're not infective, meaning you're completely cured of the disease. That's the only time you would not spread disease. It's because you don't have any disease organisms to spread. But this is a trick question. I won't ask it on a quiz or an exam, but it's something to think about. Whenever you're in a disease, no matter what period you're in, you can spread disease. My mother always used to tell me, "Oh, I'm getting better now. I'm no longer infective." And I would tell her, "Mom, you're speaking to a microbiologist. I know better." Any questions about any of that? Let's go back to for the colds and flus, where I stated you are most infective late in the incubation period and in the prodromal period if you are an adult. The reason why is that you have the disease-carrying organism, but your immune system is not responding to the disease yet. In the period of illness, you had enough time for your immune system to respond, and in adults, the immune system sort of ties up the disease-carrying organism and then makes the infective rate decrease. So it's the host immune system which is decreasing the infectivity when an adult is in the period of illness. My guess is this relates to our caveman ancestor, that adults would rack up their immune system and then try and protect their children from getting the disease. You might notice I mentioned this is the case for adults. Children don't seem to care whether their adults, their parents get the disease or not, and that is they do not have an immune system which will rack up in the period of illness and then decrease the chance of their spreading the disease. And this is true of children who are 12 years old. I'm not sure when this starts to change. Obviously, it's sometime probably in adolescence. But adults do, children do not. And children are as infective in the late incubation period, the prodromal period, and the period of illness. It might even be more infective in the period of illness because there's more disease-carrying organisms. All right, any questions about any of that? All right, let's talk about the spread of infection. Before somebody can become infected, they have to get the infective agent from a reservoir. A reservoir is simply a source of infection. Reservoirs can be living or non-living. For human reservoirs, meaning other humans can be a reservoir, and for certain diseases like AIDS and gonorrhea, humans are the only reservoir of disease. There can be carriers who have an inapparent infection or latent disease. And then for latency, the disease would have to come out. The disease carrying organism would have to come out of latency. But a carrier can actively spread the disease. I mentioned with COVID-19 that young people, about 50% of them will effectively be a carrier, but may not have any signs or symptoms. There's the term I was looking for. They're asymptomatic. Their disease is asymptomatic. And then they can spread the disease to their grandparents, which the disease could be much more serious. But humans can be reservoirs, even carriers. There can be animal reservoirs. Some diseases like rabies and Lyme disease, they must come from an animal, meaning a human cannot spread rabies. I'm not sure. I think, well, a human cannot directly spread Lyme disease. It doesn't spread from one patient to another. A tick can bite a human, and then that tick could spread the Lyme disease to another human, assuming the tick bites both humans. But like I said, it's not spread directly from a human. It is spread from a tick, so that's an animal disease. Some zoonoses may be transmitted to humans. A zoonosis is an animal disease that can be transmitted to humans. I think one would be rabies. That's really an animal disease. If you don't know, the rabies virus gets in the saliva of at least most animals, if not all animals. I don't know. Certainly dogs, foxes, things like that, cats. And then it can spread when that animal bites another animal or a person. Humans, the rabies virus does not go into the saliva. And so humans, if they get rabies, they would not spread it. Any question about animal reservoirs? And then there can be non-living reservoirs. Certain diseases like botulism and tetanus normally come from a non-living reservoir. Botulism usually coming from canned food. Tetanus usually coming from a puncture wound. Some other examples of non-living reservoir, meaning diseases that come from the soil, water, or lettuce. I'm sure you've heard of, I don't know, E. coli or salmonella getting on lettuce or, oh, what is that, kale? And then when people eat it, they get a disease. A non-living reservoir. Let's talk a little bit about transmission of disease. There are three principal routes by which a causative agent of disease can be transmitted from the reservoir infection to a susceptible host. There's contact transmission, and that's direct contact, like a handshake or two people kissing. There's vehicle transmission, and that is where an object transmits the disease from the disease-carrying organism to the healthy individual who then comes down with disease, such as somebody drinks out of a cup, and then the healthy individual drinks out of the same cup, picking up the disease-carrying organism. There's also vector transmission, and that is where an animal spreads the disease to a healthy person. That's usually with the bite of an animal, like the bite of a mosquito biting an infected person, or the bite of a tick and biting an infected person, and then biting a healthy person, transmitting the disease to the healthy person. Any question about any of that? All right, let's talk a little bit more about contact transmission. There are three types of contact transmission. So remember, transmission can be one of three types, and then contact transmission can be also one of three types. There's direct contact transmission, and that's direct person-to-person transmission, requiring close association between the infected and the susceptible person. A handshake is direct person to person. Kissing, direct person to person. There's also indirect contact transmission, spread from a reservoir to a susceptible host via a non-living object. We have a special term for non-living object, and it's called the fomite, something that can spread the disease from a healthy individual to an infected individual. And you can also have a fomite spreading disease from, I guess, an animal to a healthy individual. Such as somebody who's sick touches money, he turns in the money to the teller. Let's say the teller is immune, but then the teller gives the money to the next customer, and that customer touches the money, picks up the disease carrying organism, and usually inoculates it into their mucous membrane in their face, and then getting disease. Indirect contact transmission. The third contact transmission is droplet transmission. I'm going to talk about it, but you don't need to know it. And that is droplet transmission is transmission via airborne droplets that travel less than 1 meter. So somebody who sneezes or coughs and somebody is within 1 meter of that person, and then they pick up the disease, that is droplet transmission. The reason why I'm not going to ask you to learn about droplet transmission is it's very similar to a disease from a cough or sneeze that travels more than 1 meter, and that is called airborne transmission. The only distinction is, because it can be from the same cough or sneeze, the only distinction is the distance that the disease-carrying organism travels. It's droplet transmission within 1 meter, airborne transmission greater than 1 meter. And airborne transmission is not considered contact transmission. And like I said, this is all kind of hairy. And then this distinction is a little bit arbitrary, 1 meter. So here's direct contact transmission, droplet transmission from 1 meter from the, I don't know, sneeze or cough right there. But you can see the particles after 1 meter, it's less particles, but still it's from the same sneeze or cough, and you can get infected being more than 1 meter away. Indirect transmission, where the pitcher has the disease carrying organism, he touches the baseball, he throws the baseball to the catcher then touches the baseball, picking up the disease carrying organism. And that's indirect transmission via the baseball. All right, let's talk about the second transmission, and that's vehicle transmission. Vehicle is where an object transmits the disease-carrying organism to the susceptible patient. Transmission can be an inanimate reservoir, food, water, body fluids, and there's 3 types of vehicle transmission. Waterborne transmission, where the water transmits the disease-carrying organism. In third world countries, the drinking water may be contaminated with sewage, spreading waterborne transmission. Waterborne transmission is very rare in the first world countries. The only exception would be if somebody gives you something to drink and like they put their fingers inside the water and then give it to you to drink. And even that's very rare. Foodborne transmission is more likely, and that is where somebody's sick and then they either touch the food or cough on the food, putting the disease-carrying organism on the food, and then the food is eaten. Another foodborne transmission would be undercooked food, poorly stored food, and then obviously unsanitary handled food. Foodborne transmission. There's also airborne transmission, and that is airborne droplets that travel more than 1 meter. So there's 1 meter about right there. And beyond that would be smaller droplets, but same organism from the same cough or sneeze. And that's considered airborne transmission, which is considered, I don't know why, but vehicle transmission. Any question about any of that? You don't need to know about airborne transmission and droplet transmission. Like I stated, the distinction is a little bit arbitrary and it's a little complicated the way the classification falls. So I won't ask you about that. Any question about any of that? All right, let's move on to the third way that disease can be transmitted. That's vector transmission. A vector is an animal that carries the pathogen to a host. The most important group of animals or vectors are biting arthropods, especially fleas, ticks, and mosquitoes, whose bite can transmit the disease. However, an animal can transmit the disease passively, such as the fly picking up the disease-carrying organism on its feet here, and then the fly going to the food, transmitting the disease-carrying organism, and then the patient eating the food. Not the fly, just the food that the fly had landed on. So with vector transmission, there's 2 types. There's mechanical transmission, and this is a passive transport, like on the feet of the fly here, or other body parts. And then the fly transmits the disease-carrying organism either to the patient directly, like if they land on the patient's lips, or they land on the food and then the food is consumed by the human. There's also vector transmission, which is considered biological transmission, and this is where the pathogen actively reproduces inside of the vector. And then the animal, when it bites the patient, transmits the disease-carrying organisms to the patient. An example of biological transmission is malaria, which can grow in the mosquito, and then when the mosquito bites the human, they transmit the malaria to the human. Biological transmission. It's not passive, mechanical transmission. Any question about any of that? All right, let's move on to nosocomial infections. These are also called health care acquired infections. This might be the most important topic that you can learn in microbiology. A nosocomial infection is one a patient gets from checking themselves into a health care facility, such as a hospital or a nursing home or some other healthcare facility. The patient did not have this disease present or incubating at the time of their admission. They got the disease-carrying organism from their stay in the healthcare facility. It's estimated that 5 to 15% of all hospital patients acquire a nosocomial infection each year in the United States. That's 2 million people per year in the United States and 20,000 deaths per year in the United States caused by a nosocomial infection, also called a hospital-acquired infection. It used to be the 8th leading cause of death in the United States. It may be now the 9th because COVID-19 could be one of the top 8. But it used to be the 8th leading cause. I haven't looked to see what it really is. It's either the 8th or the 9th now. About 1 in 10 hospital patients get a nosocomial infection. This is from the Centers for Disease Control. And 50% of nosocomial infections are preventable. You don't need to know the numbers, but there is a total annual cost, which is expensive for nosocomial infections in the United States. You don't need to know the number, but there's some of them there. Nosocomial infections in a hospital-like setting result from the interaction of 3 factors occurring in the hospital. First, there are microorganisms in the hospital environment. Hospitals are a major reservoir of various pathogens because they have sick people in them, and these sick people can have the microorganisms, some of which can cause a nosocomial infection. And then there's some normal microbiota, which are opportunistic pathogens, and they can cause a nosocomial infection. And then the worst are some nosocomial pathogens are antibiotic resistant. And so the patient checks themselves into a healthcare facility. They then come down with a nosocomial infection that they were given in the hospital-like setting or healthcare-like setting. And then the clinician prescribes the normal antibiotic and it doesn't work. So they fall back on the second antibiotic and they order an antibiotic test to be done. On the second antibiotic, the patient is also antibiotic resistant. And then the test result comes back, but on which antibiotic to use. But by this time, it may be too late. The patient may already be dead from the resistant nosocomial infection. Any question about any of that? So one, there are microorganisms in the hospital environment. It's unavoidable. There's microbes everywhere. And then there's people in the hospital, including healthcare workers. Like I said, the normal microbiota can become an opportunistic pathogen. And then the patient in the hospital-like setting is usually a compromised host, one whose resistance to infection is either impaired by disease, by therapy, or burns. The patient may have broken skin, broken mucous membranes, which can compromise the host, making them more likely to become infected. Burn patients, injections, ventilators, urinary catheters, the administration of anesthesia, all weaken the host, either by damaging the skin or the mucous membrane or just weakening the host immune system. And then the patient may be suppressed in their immune system from their disease or whatever reason they're in the hospital. And then that can be from the disease itself suppressing the immune system, the drugs given to the patient, which can suppress the immune system, radiation therapy, and then burns. All of these affect the immune system, weakening it. And then the third reason why nosocomial infections occur in a hospital healthcare-like facility is there's a chain of transmission in the healthcare facility. The principal routes of transmission can be direct contact transmission, patient to patient. Hospitals have to take care in special care units, but also there can be direct contact transmission, hospital staff to patient. There can be indirect contact transmission via a fomite. A urinary or an IV catheter can spread the nosocomial infection. Contaminated surgical dressings can spread the infection. And even the doctor's stethoscope can spread the infection. And then lastly, there can be vehicle transmission, such as airborne transmission, where the ventilation system can actively spread the disease in the healthcare facility. I remember there was real concern about the air ventilation system spreading Ebola for the patients who came back to the United States with Ebola. It was usually a doctor or a nurse who went to Africa to help treat the Ebola, and then they picked up Ebola themselves and they came back to the United States to be treated, and the hospitals were just worried that it could be transmitted by the ventilation system. It never was, but that was the worry. If you're ever on an airplane, They recycle the air. You're in a closed environment in the jet. You just recycle the air. And that's been known for, gosh, at least 50 years that there's a problem in the airplane or the jet, and that is that the air is just recycled, and they've never come up with a way to handle that problem. They've been proposals, but all of the proposals take time and money and space, and the airline doesn't want to, um, uh, I guess, increase the cost of the trip, so they haven't followed any of the proposals. Any question about any of these? All right, how do you control nosocomial infections? There are certain procedures that are generally implemented to control nosocomial infections. First, you've learned aseptic technique now in microbiology. When you're in the healthcare facility, always use aseptic technique, and you will decrease the spread of nosocomial infections. You should proper handling contaminated materials. You should have frequent and thorough hand washing. This alone, frequent and thorough hand washing, has been shown to decrease nosocomial infection by about 50%. There's first the clinicians were educating themselves, reducing nosocomial infections, and that started about in the 1960s, maybe the 1970s. Then they educated the patients, and lastly, they've educated the visitors. If you go into any hospital or healthcare facility in the United States, there'll be signs all over the place saying, sterilize your hands, and they'll have the sanitizer in the elevators or by the door of the patient with a sign saying, sterilize your hands, reduce the spread of infection. They're talking about a nosocomial infection. There are some other techniques for controlling nosocomial infection. If you want to look at those, view the online chapter notes where we discuss that at greater detail. Any question about any of that? All right. Let's talk about two terms of epidemiology. Let me just mention a little bit more about nosocomial infection, because if you work in the healthcare facilities, and most of you will, you should really act to reduce a nosocomial infection. And I can say that because of the improved education of obviously the doctors, the staff, the patients, and the visitors, the incidence of nosocomial infection in the United States has actually decreased by a half. And I guess that would be like 1980 to 1990 to 2020, something like that. The incidence of nosocomial infection has actually decreased. So when I mentioned that it used to be around 10%, today it's actually a little lower, around 5%. And that's just recent, in the last 5 or 10 years. In the 1960s, if ever you watch a medical show or movie, you'll note that the doctor has a lab coat on, and then he's proudly wearing a stethoscope around his neck. And what does he do when he goes and visits the patient? He'll take the stethoscope and put it on their skin to listen to their heart. And then what does he do in these old shows and movies? He drops it and it thumps against his chest. And then he moves on to the next patient. And then he took a stethoscope and put it on the skin to listen to the patient's heart. It was found that doctors were actually spreading nosocomial infections in the 1960s, the early 60s, and earlier, like the 1950s, from their stethoscope. And doctors realized that in about the 1960s and the 1970s. And you've noticed now, first of all, they don't usually wear the stethoscope around their neck. And then after they use the stethoscope, they'll actually clean it. so that the next time the stethoscope is put on the skin, there will not be spreading nosocomial infectious agents. In the 1960s, Staphylococcus aureus used to be the most common nosocomial infective agent in the United States and in the first world countries. And it was largely the hospital staff that was spreading it from one patient to the staff to another patient. Staphylococcus aureus is no longer the number one nosocomial infective agent. The number one is actually E. coli, which everybody has, and I'm not sure how E. coli is actually spreading, but it's the number one nosocomial infective agent. So you want to take time after you touch a patient, even if you're wearing gloves, you should wash your hands or remove the gloves and then wash your hands and then go to the next patient and obviously put on gloves and wash your hands after touching the patient. So you're not spreading nosocomial infective agents. And as I mentioned, frequent and thorough hand washing reduces nosocomial infections by about 50%. Any question about any of that? All right, some terms of epidemiology. Epidemiology is the study of where and when disease occurs and how diseases are transmitted in populations. The CDC collects and analyzes US epidemiological information. Usually what happens is there will be certain diseases that we call notifiable diseases, those that physicians are required by law to report. And the physician will turn them in to the county health facility, which for Washington would be to Vancouver for Clark County, the county health offices. And then the county health offices turned it into the state health offices. And I don't know where the state offices are in Washington. If anyone knows, you can let me know. I used to live in Oregon, and Salem was where the counties turned in the state information. And then the state information sends that information to the CDC. They then collect it and then publish it weekly in the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report. Morbidity, incidence of disease and sickness; mortality, the incidence of deaths. And it's in a weekly report called the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report, or the MMWR. And you can find that at www.cdc.gov. I used to be able to find that very easily, but they moved it, and it's not so easy to find anymore. Oops, that doesn't work. And like I said, all notifiable diseases, diseases that by law a physician has to report, will be in these morbidity and weekly. Let me see if I can find that. There it is right there. Latest reports. I was looking for a table of the numbers, but I'm not finding that. All right, any questions about any of that? Some two terms from epidemiology. Morbidity is the incidence of a specific notifiable disease. The morbidity rate the number of people affected in relation to the total population in a given time period. So morbidity, the number of people affected, that would be people who are sick as well as people who have died over a given time period. Mortality, the deaths from a notifiable disease. The mortality rate, the number of deaths from a disease in relation to the population in a given time period. All right, any questions from chapter 14? I think I want to get started with chapter 13, and I promise we're not going to do more than just introduce the topic, and then I'll stop early. Where the heck is chapter 13? Yep, moved it inside. All right, chapter 13 is viruses, viroids, and prions. The major goal in the rough outline is shown here. We're going to talk about the terms of viruses. What's a capsid? What's an envelope? What's a spike? What is a bacteriophage? What is a lytic virus? What is a lysogenic virus? What is a prophage? What is a provirus? What is a latent virus? What is a persistent infection? What is a prion? And then what is a viroid? You need to understand the characteristics, the structure, and the classification of viruses. And 3, understand about viral multiplication. Viruses only have certain ways that they multiply. We call these life cycles. And then 4, understand about prions and viroids. Any question about what we're going to cover? The only goal a virus has is to replicate. How viruses replicate is they have this general strategy. They invade a host cell, hijack it, and then force that host cell to make more viral copies. The viral copies then escape. Let's watch a little movie on that. Oh, just a little slow here. Phage is another term for a bacteriophage. It's a bacteriovirus.
In the microscopic world of bacteria, a miniature act of piracy is about to take place. T4 bacteriophages. With their spider-like tail fibers and prism-shaped heads, these viral marauders plan to hijack an unsuspecting bacterium and use it as their own metabolic nursery. This E. coli bacterium has seen its last day. Binding to its surface, the virus injects its precious cargo of genetic material into the cell, commanding it to produce a new batch of T4 bacteriophages. In a final act, the bacterium is forced to self-destruct, releasing hundreds of viruses ready to kill again.
All right, any question about that? Here's some general characteristic of viruses. Viruses are inert when they are not within a host cell. Viruses display little or no metabolic activity outside of their host cell. You can talk about whether viruses are alive or not. That is an argument we're not going to get into, but they do not have metabolism outside of their host cell. Inside of their host cell is the only time a virus has metabolic activity. Viruses require a living host to multiply. So in a sense, they are obligate intracellular parasites. Parasites that must live within their host cell. They multiply within living cells by using the host cell's enzymes, nucleic acids, amino acids, and other molecules that the host cell provides for the virus. Viruses have no ATP generating mechanism. They simply use the ATP in the cytoplasm of their host cell. Viruses may contain either DNA or RNA, but never do they have both. So a virus will have a genome that's either DNA or RNA, and never both. All viruses have a protein coat surrounding the nucleic acid. So this virus would cut away this wall of the protein coat to look inside of it. And there you can see the genome, which is either DNA or RNA. And then that'll be surrounded by a protein coat shown here. Some viruses are further surrounded by an outer lipid envelope, which would be out here, like a circle around the protein coat. The host range of a virus is the range of cells a virus can infect. The host range is determined by specific host attachment sites that we call receptors, and these receptors can be on the cell wall, the flagella, cellular factors necessary for viral multiplication. The virus has a molecule which binds to the receptor, so the receptor is a molecule on the host cell. The virus has a molecule on its outer surface called either a ligand or an adhesion, and that molecule binds to the receptor. And this specific binding is why viruses usually only infect the cells of one or a few species, meaning most viruses are very specific for the cells that they can infect. For example, HIV can only infect some cells, meaning not all human cells, but some cells like the T cells and the macrophages and brain cells. The HIV cell cannot infect your muscle cell or your bone cell. And then they can only infect cells of two species, humans, and then one of the chimps, one of the chimpanzees. And most viruses are very specific for the number of cells that they can infect. There are some exceptions, like Western equine encephalitis, which can infect many different species. Let me think about that. Is that one that's affected by birds? I know most mammals can get Western equine encephalitis, including humans and rodents, and I think it's spread by mosquito too, so it can grow in the mosquito. Or maybe it's a tick, something like that. That's an unusual case where the virus can grow in all these different species. Most viruses are specific. Bird flu is another example of one which has got a wide range of animals that it can infect. It usually spreads among birds, but there's many different species of birds that the virus can infect and then grow in. And usually viruses are much more specific than that. And then, if you don't know, bird flu can infect humans and at least other mammals, I think it can infect at least all other warm-blooded animals. I don't know about cold-blooded, but I think it can infect most warm-blooded animals. And most viruses do not have such a wide range of cells that they can infect and then multiply in. Most infect and only replicate in one or a few species. Any question about any of that? And that specification is mainly due to the molecules on the virus binding to the receptor molecules on the host cell. Any question about any of that? All right, I think I'm going to stop here, giving you 8 minutes of free time. Any questions? If not, I will see you next week. We will be meeting on Tuesday of next week. I think next week is Thanksgiving. That's why we're only meeting on Tuesday. And obviously, if you have a question about the lab, I will be in the lab from 6:30 to 6:45. Any questions? All right, goodbye.